Hey everybody, and welcome back to Sweatpants BI. This is part 8 of our HR report walkthrough. And in this video, we're going to get away from design and cosmetics, and we're going to focus more specifically on adding some interactive elements to our Power BI tool, namely a slicer panel that users can expand and collapse when they don't need to see all of the slicers in the report. And I'm also going to walk through an example of designing a really cool report page tooltip, which is something that I honestly always include, probably between 3 and 5 in every single Power BI report that I build. I'm a huge fan of report page tooltips. For me, they're just so much fun for my audience to interact with and engage with, and I feel like it's a really great eureka moment for them, or at least I see the light bulb go off when my stakeholders and my business partners engage with report page tooltips that, wow, Power BI is really powerful and super cool. So report page tooltips, I'm going to show you how to build one if you never have. If you are already very familiar with report page tooltips, then I'm sure you're going to agree that this is just one more example of an interactive feature that we can add to our HR report to just give it that extra wow factor. So really excited for this video. Let's go ahead and jump into it. So the first user feature that we're going to add to our report is going to be a custom slicer panel. And yes, you could absolutely use the filter panel that's already built in here and add something, like the gender field over here to give users the ability to select female or male and close the filters. That's a totally viable way of handling filters in your report, especially where more categorical data is involved. However, if you have different kinds of filters that you're hoping to use and things like sliders, or if you want to leverage a wide range of styles for your slicers, then I find that a slicer panel can give you a little bit more flexibility and just open up some new design options. So setting up our slicer panel is going to be pretty easy. And once we have the first slicer panel built on this headcount page, it's going to be very rinse and repeat to sort of build the same thing on our retention and turnover pages. So let's go ahead first and just go to insert, and let's insert a button into the top right corner here. And this button, I'm just going to drag over here. I'm going to open up my style options. I don't need an icon. I don't need a border. The only thing that I need here is text. And I'm going to use a custom icon to open up my control and slicer panel. And usually I use something called a trigram. Sometimes you might hear this referred to as a hamburger symbol. But I'm just going to go up here. You can see the first one. This is a Unicode trigram that I've Googled. And I'm just going to open this up. And I'm just going to copy the icon. I like to use Unicode because I can just open up my style options and drop that character right into my text options to create that button. There it is. It's very small, but since it's text, you can just resize it to your heart's content. Let's go ahead and try 24. I think you can even bold it a little bit if you want. There you go. See how it's bolding? And I'm just going to kind of resize this and get it into position in that top right corner. And I'm also even going to get a little bit fancier with it by having an option that when the user hovers over it, maybe try making it just sort of a flash of orange. Might even use a slightly darker orange. There we go, just to make it a little bit easier to see. You can even set it to bold a little bit when the user hovers over it. And that's all we're going to do with this button. This button is just going to be used to open up our slicer panel. So now let's go ahead and start building out our slicer panel, which is really just going to be a menu that appears with a bunch of different slicers from our data set. So first, we're going to need a background for our slicer menu. So I'm going to go ahead and just drop a rectangle. Doesn't have to be very big. We're not going to add a whole bunch of slicers to this menu. In fact, this ought to do just fine. The main thing that we're going to do with this rectangle is we're going to change it to a dark kind of gray. And then something that I like to do when building slicer panels is give this just a hint of transparency so that the user can always kind of see all of the visuals on the page updating in real time based on the user filter or slicer selections. I'm going to go ahead and make this just a smidge larger. There we go. And now that we have that, let's just go ahead and start adding our first slicer. So I'm going to grab a slicer, and I'm going to just kind of shrink this to about this size. And since I've already got my demographics page open, let's just go ahead and add age group as our first slicer. And I'm going to open up my slicer settings. I'm going to turn this into a drop down, and I'm going to go to General, go to Effects, get rid of the background, head back to Visual. And now let's give the background of our actual slicer box a white background so that it's easy to make out. Let's go ahead and change it to DIN font. I'm going to increase the size to 14, ought to do it. And now let's make sure that people can also see the header of the slicer. For that, obviously we want something that will stand out well against that dark gray background. So let's give it a white font. I'm going to increase the size a little bit. Next, I'm going to head back to my slicer selection settings. I'm going to turn off the multi-select with control so that users can, just pick whatever they want to without holding down control. You can even add the select all option if you want. And now that is the same, slicer settings that I want to use on all the others. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab, we could probably get away with adding 8 or 9 slicers to this, but just to keep things very nice and clean for the space that I gave myself, I'm just going to add, let's try that one more time. There we go. I'm going to align everything to the left so you can see I've got 7 slicers here now. Let's go ahead and for our next one, we'll use our gender field, then we'll use our race field, then we'll use department, subdepartment, and then let's go with education, and last but not least, let's go with job level. And you can see that, I've got underscores in some of these, lowercase, age group is uppercase. So real quickly, I'm just going to click on the name over here of the field that I'm using in the slicer. I'm just going to rename it within the context of the slicer. Of course, this isn't changing the actual name of the field in the data set. It's basically just allowing me to quickly capitalize the names in the header of the slicer. And job level. And then once we're done with that, we're ready to basically go ahead and set up our relationship between the button that we created to open the slicer panel and our actual slicer panel. And of course, to do this, we're going to need to utilize a really important and useful feature in Power BI called Bookmarks. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my bookmark pane and my selection pane over here that lists all of the items and objects on my report. And you can see as I hover over the slicers here, you'll see them also lighting up on the left, showing which slicer I'm hovering on. And what we're going to do here is we are just going to grab everything that makes up our slicer pane, and I'm just going to group those, and I'm going to call this group slicer pane, slicer panel. They mean the same thing, so call it whichever one you want. And next, I'm going to add a new bookmark, and this is going to be called Headcount Slicers Open. And the other one that I add is going to be called Headcount Slicers Closed. And since we've got our slicer pane open right now, I'm just going to go ahead and grab everything that makes up my slicer pane. And then I'm going to right click on my Headcount Slicers Open bookmark. I'm going to change this from all visuals to just the selected visuals. In other words, all of the visuals that I currently have selected. I'm going to turn off the data setting so that when I trigger either of these bookmarks, it basically saves whatever filters or selections I've made in these slicers instead of overwriting them when I trigger these bookmarks. And then I'm going to, oops, I did the wrong one. And now I'm just going to update my Headcount Slicer Open bookmark. And for my other bookmark, Headcount Slicers Closed, of course, I want these slicers to disappear. So since I have them all selected right now, let's just go ahead and hit Hide to instantly hide everything that makes up my slicer pane. Then I'm going to reselect all of those objects by holding down Shift and just selecting. Then I'm going to go ahead and click over here. I want to make sure that I have just selected visuals triggered, data turned off, and then let's go ahead and hit Update. Now, when I click on these bookmarks, you'll see that it has the effect of turning on, or in other words, revealing my slicers or hiding them, as you can see with the eyeball having sort of the slash through it. So now all I need to do is I need to go ahead and tie this trigram button up here. We're going to go ahead and turn the action to bookmark, set it to slicers open so that when the user selects this trigram icon, it turns on the bookmarks. And if we want the user to close this, we could add something like an X to this corner, or we could also just sort of stretch this out a little bit. And let's go ahead and just shrink these bookmarks back, or these slicers rather, back down to try 270 and kind of move those over here. And then on this shape that is in my background, let's go ahead and open our style settings. Let's go ahead and open our rotation settings, and we're going to rotate our text 270, I think, but I'm probably wrong with this. Then we're going to turn on the text. Let's type TBD just to see where our text is. Make that text white. The moment, I'm still not seeing it. Looks like it's there in the middle. So yeah, it did go, it's doing exactly what I was hoping it would do. We're just going to move that text to the top of this visual. And remember, that's the top relative to the 270-degree rotation that we're doing here. Notice that if I change this to something like 90, now my text is over here. If I change it to 180, my text is upside down here at the bottom. It's how I know I need 270. Then I'm going to go ahead and drag this back in a little bit. And all we want to do is we just want to give the user some kind of message telling them to click here to close the slicer menu. And once we have that, all we have to do is turn on the action for this shape and set it to a bookmark and set it to slicers closed. And now we have a perfectly functional slicer panel that we can use. And because we don't want to reinvent the wheel, really all we want to do now is we just want to highlight everything that makes up our slicer panel, including our trigram button. And let's just copy, and we're going to paste our slicer panel onto the other pages of our report. And of course, now that we have our slicer panel on each page of our report, there is one more thing that we need to do. And that is we need to set up new bookmarks for our other pages, which is why I called these bookmarks Headcount Slicers Open and Headcount Slicers Closed, because currently, if I were to go here and select this action, pay close attention to the pages down here, but selecting this button, of course, is going to take me back to Headcount and open the slicer pane there, because that's how I saved all of these settings when I created these bookmarks. So we are going to need 4 more bookmarks, 2 for each of our other pages, and we need the same settings, just selected visuals. We don't want data enabled. So I'm just selecting selected visuals. I'm turning off data. So you can see for each of these bookmarks, what we want checked down here is selected visuals, and what we want turned off here is data for every one of these. And so let's go ahead and call the next bookmark retention slicers open and retention slicers closed and turnover slicers open and turnover slicers closed. And let's go ahead and head over to retention. And the first thing that we want to do is we want to go ahead and swap out our actions and point at retention slicers open and retention slicers closed, and then turnover slicers open and turnover slicers closed. And now we want to update the actual settings for each of these bookmarks. So first, let's just go ahead and select everything that makes up our slicer panel. Currently, we can see it. So let's go ahead. We're on the retention page. Our slicer panel is open. Let's go ahead and right-click on retention slicers open and update that bookmark. And then we're going to hide everything that makes up our slicer panel, reselect all of those items, and update slicers closed. Then we're going to go to our turnover page, and we're going to open up our slicer panel, select everything that makes up our slicer panel, and update our slicers open bookmark. Then we're going to hide everything, select everything that makes up the slicer panel, and update slicers closed. Now, on each page, we have the ability to open our slicer panel and close it. Another super helpful user feature is something called Report Page Tooltips. And if you're watching this and you don't know what a tooltip is, I guarantee you have seen one before. A tooltip is just this little window of information that appears here when I hover over different items in this bar chart. You can see that it's filtering and updating dynamically, and it's literally just showing, the item that I'm hovering over, as well as the underlying measure, which of course is head count for this first page. Well, there are other way fancier and cooler things that we can do with tooltips than just the default tooltip in Power BI that just sort of shows the underlying fields that we're using from our data and measures that make up this data visual. So what if we wanted to, on this headcount page, give the user the ability to understand a little bit about the top and bottom earners in terms of salary in the company for any data point that they hover over? Well, not a huge deal. What we're going to do here is we're going to just create a brand new page over here. And I'm going to just call this tooltip, because I don't have to be original on this one, because I'm just going to hide this page. So it doesn't really matter what I call it, as long as I know that it's a tooltip. And the reason that I'm hiding this page is that this tab is not for the user to click into in this scenario. The only way that the user will be able to interact with this tab is through the Report Page Tooltip feature. And so before I do anything on this page, let's just go ahead and head over to our Canvas settings. I'm going to drop open page information, and I'm going to say that I want to allow use as a tooltip. And you can see that Power BI just automatically gave me a much smaller canvas to work with, but that's fine for demonstration purposes. Now I'm going to go back over to my headcount page, and I'm going to click on this visual because this is the visual that I want to use this tooltip page for, instead of the built-in tooltip feature that you're seeing right here. That's kind of like the default tooltip. So I'm going to go ahead and open up Format Your Visual. I'm going to go to General, going to click on Tooltips, and you can see that currently it's using Report Page Auto, which is just the default setting. Instead of using Auto, I'm going to say I want to use this tooltip page that I created down here. And of course, calling it tooltip and referencing a tooltip may be a little bit confusing. So just to be clear, if I called this page something stupid like Larry, and then I went back to this visual and clicked on General and went to Tooltips, you'll see that Larry is now the name of the page. So this is just the name of the page that I'm referencing here. And I'm going to change it back to Tooltip because Larry is kind of dumb. But anyway, now that I have that enabled, notice when I click on my Tooltip settings and specify that I want to use the tooltip page that I created here on this visual, now I just have a blank and empty window that you'll notice is almost exactly square shaped, just like my new tooltip canvas here. So of course, we don't have to settle for this tiny box here. If we want to make this tooltip page the size of a regular old Power BI page, we absolutely can. I'm not going to make it quite that big, but I am going to give this a 500 pixel height and a 750, let's even make it 800 pixel width. Now notice when I head back over to that visual, you'll see my tooltip is now much larger and the proportions match exactly the size of the canvas that I created. And one other thing that I like to do when I'm creating tooltips is I'm just going to go ahead and give this sort of a different aesthetic. As a matter of fact, I'm going to give this a dark aesthetic, which pops out extra well against the light theme in the rest of my report. Now on this page, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and drop in from my people fact table, a table that contains full names. And I'm going to drop in, let's try dropping in their hire dates. I don't want to use the date hierarchy. I'm just going to use hire date. And I'm going to format my hire date by clicking on it and going up here to my formatting settings. I like to use short date because it doesn't take up a lot of room here. And I'm going to drop in my salary field. And I'm just going to sort this from top to bottom. You can see the CEO here is number 1. I'm also going to rename this hire date field within the context of the column name. Just going to call it hire date, going to lose that underscore, and I'm going to call sum of salary just salary. And now you'll notice first and foremost that when I go over to my headcount page, as I filter, notice that these names instantly change to show me the top earners in each department. But you'll also notice, of course, that I have that scroll bar on the far right of the table that keeps constantly resizing. And of course, since I'm just viewing this report page, I can't actually interact with the tooltip, and you'll see it disappears the second I try to hover on top of it. So what we want to do for the user is instead of, including a scroll bar that the user can't actually scroll through, let's just go ahead and make the executive decision to cut this visual off at, let's try the top 20 salary earners. And so I'm just going to drop down full name. I'm going to specify that I want the filter type to be top N. I'm going to say that I want it to show 20 items based on sum of salary, and then I'm going to apply my filters. And you can see that the 20 values fit almost perfectly. And you can see that my top 20 salary earners make up about $5 million. Personally, I don't think that this $5 million is really contributing that much. After all, when I go over here, that total is going to constantly change to just show the top 20 earners for each department. That's probably unnecessary information for this particular visual. It's okay to disagree. This is just one of my personal preference things. So let's just go ahead and turn off my totals. Next, I'm going to go over to General. Let's turn off the background. And now let's just kind of reformat this visual. I'm going to leave about half of the page because I'm actually going to drop another visual in here. Maybe you can already guess what it is. I'm going to make these columns a little bit wider. It's like performing heart surgery as far as it's just so hard to perfectly line up to get that spacer where I can make my columns larger, but I digress. Let's go ahead and change our formatting here to sort of match this dark background, which means, of course, that we have to go to our row and column settings and match the colors in the backgrounds of our cells to the background of our canvas, which doesn't take very long. Let's just go ahead and update our background color for the column headers to the same color, or at least something fairly similar to what we've got in the background. I'm going to change this to an orange color just to sort of highlight my titles here. Can make the sizes a little bit larger. Next, let's go ahead and go to our grid settings and get rid of this blue underline here, which is under our border settings. I'm going to go ahead and you can turn it off, you can make it the same color, or you can just try adjusting its width. It's kind of up to you. Let's just get rid of it by blending it into the background. And now for the row values here, let's just go ahead and update our values using the same color that we have in the background. Now you can see the values are still there, but they're really hard to read because of the color choices I've made. So let's go ahead and change our color settings. Let's see what white looks like. Not bad. Let's go ahead and change it to DIN like all of the other fonts in our report. Now I'm going to go ahead and change these sort of grid lines here from this light gray for my horizontal grid lines. Let's try making it black so that the user can still kind of see them, and maybe it helps them read, across the rows that much easier. Now, before we go on to our next table, the other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my grid settings, drop down options, and see if I can add just a little bit of additional padding to the report. And once I'm satisfied that that looks pretty good, I'm just going to copy the same table and I'm just going to drag it over just enough that the tables kind of sit side by side. I'm going to put just a little bit more padding between them. There we go. And of course, the hardest part of working with tables is just resizing the columns, but not a big deal. And for the second table here, the only change that we're really going to make is instead of referencing the top 20, we're going to reference the bottom 20 and apply. And since we're doing the bottom 20, you can either leave it as is, or maybe you want to resort and have the highest earners going top to bottom and the lowest earnings going bottom to top to more easily sort of identify those individuals who were earning the least amount of money in our head count. And because another data visualization issue presents itself when you have side-by-side tables, is that someone may look at these tables and just, at a glance assume that they're the same table. So you might want to consider giving some visual cues to the user to really help them understand that we're really fundamentally looking at two different things here. So for this specific scenario, let's go ahead and change up some of our formatting options by giving our salary column some conditional formatting. So in this instance, I'm going to grab my salary column, which is over here. I'm going to click on the little caret and select conditional formatting, and I'm going to add a background color. And what I'm going to do here is, since I'm using a dark theme, I want my lowest value to be very, very subtle. I want it to almost match my background. In other words, the lowest values for salary, which are down here, are basically not going to look all that conditionally formatted at all. And you can choose how you want to scale this. I'm actually going to keep, this as gray as I can possibly get it, as dark gray, and only the highest values, which if I drag this to the side, is obviously going to be the CEO up here, this Kip O'Finan. I never know. Again, these are all, I think, artificially created names, but I'm going to set the highest value to green to really help capture that highest earner. I'm also going to, let's just go ahead and rename, instead of calling, these names, which of course this says full name, let's call this 10 highest earners. And of course, we're talking about the people here. So I don't have to say that these are names. People are going to know that these are names. Oop, and I forgot we're actually doing the 20 highest earners. So just saying full name really isn't that helpful. Calling this column 20 highest earners tells us exactly who these people are. I mean, obviously, these are names. They may be extremely cheesy, kind of confusing names. I doubt that you're going to meet most people with these names on the street, but at least now we know who these names represent instantly. Something else that you might want to consider doing here is, since we have kind of a green theme going here, maybe you want to change your column names to that same sort of green. And over here, since these are our lowest earners, let's go ahead and change the full names here to 20 lowest earners. And we can change our column names. Instead of orange, maybe we want to use red. See if the lighter red looks a little bit better. I kind of like it more. And for our conditional formatting here on salary, we want to take the opposite approach. Here, we're more concerned with the lowest values because we're trying to spotlight those individuals who make up our current headcount who earn the least money. So let's go ahead and instead use orange as our highlight. I'm going to add a middle color, and I'm going to use the same dark gray to really draw the eye's attention up here. So now we've got our side-by-side salary comparison tooltip. Let's head back over to our headcount page. And now we can hover over any of these items and instantly see the top 20 and bottom 20 earners for each department. And maybe we also decide we want to apply the same technique to our map. So let's go ahead and head down to our tooltip settings on our map, and let's also use the same tooltip page that we created, but now we can scroll across the country. And of course, all of this is dynamically filtering in the background so that we can see our top earners and lowest earners all across the United States. Now, before we are done here, technically we've already built and finished the tooltip, but there's one more thing that I want to do before we move on, and that is I want to call out the fact that I loathe when people add really cool features like this tooltip and they forget to tell the user about it. So one more thing that you might want to consider doing in your tool is adding just something like a text box or something, and let's go ahead and remove its background. And I'm going to go ahead and just drag this into roughly this empty white space that we haven't really done anything with. And I'm just going to add a note to the user that department and city visuals below have a special tooltip feature enabling analysis for top, bottom 20 salary earners. Again, it doesn't have to be anything super fancy. You're just letting your users know that there is something cool that they don't want to miss. And of course, there are all kinds of different ways to implement something like this message, but you at least want to try to do your due diligence and let the users know, hey, dummy, you have to hover on this visual to really get the most out of it. Otherwise, you would be surprised at how many people just look at your Power BI report and they're like, yeah, all of this looks nice. But they don't get to interacting with the visual. And it's not necessarily their fault. A lot of your users and a lot of companies don't know Power BI the way that you or other Power BI developers know it. So they don't know that data-driven tooltip report pages are a thing. They don't think to hover over the visual for more insights. So of course, when you build a really cool feature, make sure your user knows about it by just telling them and even leaving a note on the report page if you must. So there's our report page tooltip. Now let's go ahead and start rounding this report out by building a cover page that also tells our users what to expect in this